thank you all for coming to the FlaskCon. Let me get started by introducing myself and my talk. So, my name is Bruno. I live in the north of Portugal and I've been involved in open source software since 2003. And I like to work with open source, and I have been involved in many open source projects and many years getting involved into the Flask community. So, I created some Flask extensions like Flask Simple Login, Flask Google Maps, Flask Sitemap, and also I have contributed with Flask Admin. I helped creating a CMS using Flask and MongoDB. I created Flasker, which is an extension that is the backend for HTTP Bean, which is a website for testing requests that now is baked by Postman. And currently, I am the creator and maintainer of Dynaconf, which is a Python general purpose configuration library that I'll be showing how to integrate with Flask today. And right now I'm working as a principal software engineer at Red Hat, developing the Ansible automation platform. So let's get started. The title of my talk is Don't Think About Settings, Use Dynaconf. But yeah, obviously you're gonna need to think about settings in some way, and Dynaconf is here to help you with the basics. Like, you don't need to think how to structure your settings and what you can need in the future if you are just starting your application and you don't have idea of which kind of problems you're gonna need to solve around settings management. So Dynaconf tries to put all together and offer a library that can solve the most of the problems. So let's start by looking on which problem Dynaconf tries to solve. So this here is my development environment, and you can see on the left side I have a very simple Flask application, so there's nothing special on this application. I'm just initializing Flask app, defining a database key on the configuration here, so this is the most important part of this example. And here on my unique field that I have here, I am just returning the value that we have there. So it's a string, and then when I run this with the Flask run command, and then I do curl, I'm gonna see that here the server responded with the settings that I have in the config map. So this is very simple. I think most of the Flask application works this way. Obviously, we in real life, we don't print our settings to the Word. This example is just to show you it in real time how it works. But you're gonna have some database connection strings. You're gonna have some feature flags. You're gonna have things like this. And let's say you just like finished development some feature of this application, and you need to put this into production. So in the example I have here, I'm connected to a database, like hypothetically a localhost database that binded at this port, and now I'm gonna be like deploying this in a Kubernetes environment and some cloud, and probably this database here is going to be pointed in another address. So how do you do when you need to like deploy the application that you develop locally and you need to put this in production or in testing, in staging, or other multiple kinds of environment you might have? How do you say to your application which group of settings it should be using? Or in other words, how do I change this value dynamically? So how do I point my database to other place? And that's why the project is called Dynaconf. So we can use our intuition and try to get things from how Flask works. So we know that if you go to your command line and you export the variable flask_debug equals true and do Flask run, then you are going to serve your application and it's going to be in debug mode. So this is very normal and very nice. So by looking at this, I might think that if I have configuration and debug is part of the configuration, looks like I can say flask_anything and just change this value, and then my app is gonna be like ready to deployment. So then let's try to do this. So following our intuition, after reading the documentation and the getting started guide, we just go and do flask_database. We try to change that value and point to a production server and a production bind. And then we try to run our application and it fails. So it's still connecting to the local host that is hard-coded in our application and not respecting what we have here exported in the Flask_database. So this is frustrating. I see many people with questions like this when they are starting with Flask. And the thing is that Flask doesn't support you exporting any kind of variable here to contribute to your config map. So Flask support just like a subset of variables, like the bug and the current environment. So you can't do this. So you end up being like frustrated because the only solution you have right now is going to your code, change your settings, or probably building another image if you're working in a container environment, or probably you're gonna need to read environment variables and think about the best practices, like how do I read environment variables, which is the best way to do that. So that's why I say don't be frustrated, don't think about it, just use Dynaconf to solve your problem. So what is Dynaconf? Dynaconf is a library that I created 8 years ago. It's heavily based and inspired on the 12-factor application guide, which has been created by Heroku with the best practices around cloud deployment and applications. And it's also very based on environment variables, so it does the management of environment variables in a very structured way that you can use without need to think about it. And it supports lots of things, like you can protect your sensitive information, you can read multiple file formats, like if you want to put your settings in TOML, YAML, JSON, INI, and Python. And also you can create your custom loaders if you want to read the data that you need to be included in your configuration from databases like MySQL or Postgres. You can use out-of-the-box servers like HashiCorp Vault and Redis. And of course, it comes with Django and Flask plugins that you can use out of the box. This is a general purpose, so you can use it in any kind of Python project, but it's especially designed by web application running on cloud, like SaaS applications. So right now, Dynaconf is considered a critical project in the Python ecosystem. So it means it's being in the top 1% of most downloaded libraries. In the repository on GitHub, you can see that the dependency graph is growing a lot. So we have a lot of packages and repositories depending on Dynaconf, and it's being heavily, we got lots of contributors and the package is being updated, so and evolving. I can mention projects that I worked with, which is projects we have at Red Hat, like Satellite, Ansible, and IQE, but also Microsoft, for example, is using on the packages.microsoft.com, but there is large list of large companies using and contributing back to Dynaconf project. So the 12-factor application guide that is available on the web, you can see on the section 3 about the configuration. And the main idea here is that you need to separate your configuration from your application. So we were looking to that example where we have a configuration hard-coded into the app code itself. And that's not a very good idea, because there are these cases where we need to quickly mutate how the configuration is done. So for that cases, we need to separate or put your configuration in a separate set of files or in an external service. So that's how we designed it, Dynaconf. So it comes with Flask extension. So using the Flask extension is very simple. It follows all the standards on the Flask community. You just import the Flask Dynaconf from the Dynaconf package after installing it, and then you can initialize it on your Flask application. So the most important thing it does is that it's going to be replacing your app config, which is also something that is encouraged by the Flask developers, with a custom config class, which is going to be Dynaconf settings. And from that point on, you can just use Flask_anything to export variables that will be impacting in your config map for your Flask application. And then it's going to be the intuitive way that I was talking about. So you can not only export Flask debug, but you can export any of the other variables. So how it works in practice. So get back to my development environment and you can see the same application. The change I made here is that I commented out this line where I hard-coded my database connection string, and now I load Dynaconf. And I pass the app, and then I pass any configuration that I need to initialize to the Dynaconf instance. And then this is going to be the same thing as I have in the line 6. But after you do that, your settings are now managed by Dynaconf. So your application now runs in the same way. But look at this. Now you can do this. You can do Flask_database or Flask_anything you want. Any key that you have or any key that you need to be included there. Don't need to be keys that are strictly here. You can have a schema-less way of including keys in your config map, or you can say Dynaconf, that Dynaconf will accept only a specific set of keys. You can put validators. So there's a set of things that you can do to ensure that your settings are valid. But this common use case is just like you pass, like you give the management of our config to Dynaconf, and then you give those abilities mainly around environment variables, but not only this. So now you can see that we are able to see, like, we are connected to prod server because it's respecting the value that's on the environment variable. So that's usually what we want, especially to do deployment on Kubernetes, where you're going to have like dynamic config maps, or on the CI servers, like on GitHub Actions, where you just want to have these variables as part of the job definition. So Dynaconf can work with simple variables like this one I was showing you before, like just like key value as developing a string, like an environment variable. You know that environment variables doesn't have types. Everything that you export to environment variable is going to be read by Python as a string. So Dynaconf leverages the environment variable loading, and then it supports typing. So what you can do is you can have this database now as a structure, like as a dictionary. And even if it's a dictionary with nested attributes, or if it's a list with indexes and positions, so what you can do is you can use the environment variable to contribute to the list in the same way. So here you see what we are doing. Now we have a better separation of values, and we are using the double underscore to access nesting. So there's no limit. You can go nesting into all the levels of your data structure, and Dynaconf will just like push this data to your Flask app config. And you see here in the running curl call I did here that all the values are there, exactly the way we exported on the environment variable. So this is one of the best, I can say, features that Dynaconf has, because you are not like limited by environment variable, and you can see that your Flask application is still simple. You don't need to be doing like casting, deciding which data type you want. So by default, Dynaconf uses TOML parser. So every value that is a valid TOML is going to be parsed as a TOML. So you can export the port like I did here, and the port here is a string for the environment variable, but it's going to be read as an integer by Dynaconf, because Dynaconf can do the inference, and you can even like create your own data types if you need. So this is one of the things that Dynaconf can do. But also, as I say, it's very dynamic and flexible. So let's say you want to provide this information in a better like way for your team needs. So you can pass a TOML document here, which is more explicit. You don't need to like use the double underscore. And then in the same way, you can override the database dictionary by passing this here. But if you are reading this data from somewhere like a server that holds your keys or something like this, you can even force Dynaconf to infer that data as a JSON. And JSON is not the only one data type. There's other data types supported, and you can create your own, as I said, and then tell Dynaconf how to parse it, and it's going just loading. So, for example, I see projects where people are loading this data from AWS config manager, and then they just like create a custom data type called AWS, and then they pass the path here, and Dynaconf just go into whatever logic they put in their custom loaders, because the project is very like extensible, and then it keeps working. So another use case that we see, and especially when running on the CI or any kind of automation, is that we often wants to reuse some parts of the configuration to build another configuration keys. So Dynaconf support interpolation on the values. So you see I added here a new key called domain. It could be like a base API path or something that it's important to build all the paths in your application. That's the most common use case. And let's say you want to be like building it in the command line, like building the block. So Dynaconf supports Jinja, also other kinds of lazy template loaders. Everything here is going to be lazy, so you can really do very nice thing here to provide the end result. All this is baked by, is validated by Dynaconf validators, so we can set a schema and tell Dynaconf that you need this data to be real, valid according to your constraints. But the way it works is very simple. You can see here, I'm exporting the database host, but I'm saying that the value of database host is going to be lazily at the runtime evaluated by Jinja templates, and then it's going to take like this fixed part here where I say postgres.prod, and then this.domain. So this is going to point to the app config, and anything that is on the domain is going to be like present. So here you can see the result, and it's correctly interpolated by Dynaconf. So it works with Jinja, but you can also, as I said, include your own logic if you need. But I told you about the environment variables, which is very important and the base for everything. And I really recommend that the most you can do using environment variables is going to be best for you, for the team that is operating your application on the cloud. But you can also have config files, because config files are also very used, especially if you want to have defaults. So Dynaconf supports multiple formats, as I said in the beginning. So you can use toml, YAML, .ini. You can use Python with uppercase variables, and you can even like write your own loader for any kind of file you want. So how it works, the same application. The only thing I did is now I pass settings files to the Dynaconf initializator, and then I build this file, use toml, but it could be any kind of format. It's going to be very similar, and you can see that this file is layered by different environments. So I have the defaults, which is by default on the default key. So instead of having the default set in the Flask application itself, we do this in the settings file. This settings file can be shipped and packaged with the application itself, or it can be like deployed by some configurator when you are doing your deployment. It can be part of a mounting point in your Kubernetes. So it gives you this kind of flexibility. And then it's the same thing as you are putting these variables in your app config. So Dynaconf will load it and do this everything for you. So the other thing that you can by using Dynaconf and config files is now that you can separate some groups of environments. And here I created only one called production, but you can create how many you want. So you can have like a development section, a testing section, a staging section, and you can do really any name you want. It's just like a separation of which portion of the config file Dynaconf will load at any point in time. So with this example here, I can still do the same things I did before. Like I'm going to use this.domain just to load whatever is by default in the domain. You see it's on the default environment. And if I run it, you see that it does the interpolation. And on the domain part, it takes intranet.com. So it's replacing with here. So if I'm going to put this application into production, I don't want this domain, but I want this, which is on the production environment. So how do I change it in the Flask way? So we do Flask env equals production. So this is going to match whatever you have in your config file. And once you do that, everything else will be respected. Here I'm using environment variable, but this Jinja expression could be in a config file. And you can see that Dynaconf accepts also lots of config files, so you can use multiple, not like limited to a single one. And now we have the kind of data we really want, right? So using config files, I recommend, especially for when you want to have defaults and you want to have this different of the default values you are using from different kind of environments you are deploying. So another common thing that I see people struggling with is when you are running in your CI job, and there are some values that are dynamic, because every time GitHub Actions, for example, starts a new environment to run your tests, it's going to give you a different set of like domain or host or anything else. So often you need to read from the environment variables and merge the data from environment variables to your application settings. So you don't have to make those decisions, because Dynaconf can make it easier for you. So as you see, now I have here created another layered environment. I call this a staging one, just to show you that you can name whatever you want. Now I'm using the format laser loader, which will be using the Python format function under the hoods, and I'm loading env. So the env here stands for the OS environment, so it's going to be loading things from environment variables, and I want GitHub Actions domain. So how do I run it? So let's say that GitHub is going to export this variable for us. This is dynamic for every run on our jobs. It's going to change. How do we ensure that this domain is going to be reflected in our application? So we load it, whatever we want. We run our application in the same way we did before, pointing to the proper environment. And now when we run, we have all that interpolation done together. So here, there's no limit. You can do like things. In this case, I'm doing like 3 layers because I have a variable that is exported by GitHub itself. I have a variable that is on a default value in my settings file, and I have a value that I'm going to be loading from the environment variable. So if you have like simple things like this, it's gonna be easy for you to track down from where the value is coming from. But sometimes your structure is going to be more like complicated depending on the needs of your application. As I said, you can have multiple config files and you can have multiple kinds of environment variables. I'll show you how you can manage this easily with Dynaconf. But as you can see here, the most important part is your application is simple. You don't have to do many changes on your Flask application. Dynaconf manages this and this under the hood. So now let's talk about secrets, which is probably the most important thing when you think about settings. So your application is going to have tokens, it's going to be talking to external services doing authentication, and every Flask application needs a secret key, especially to use logging extensions, for example. So one of the things we do when we are starting is to put the secret key hard-coded into our app config. You can do that directly in the app config or passing this to Dynaconf. That's going to be the same thing, but it's a big no-go. You should not like put your secret key in your code or in the files that goes into your repository. So in this example, I have this included in the key and also included in the settings toml file. So let's say these 2 files are going to be pushed to your Git repository. You should never put secret keys, passwords, and anything that is sensitive in your repository. There are excellent tools that can like validate it for you and prevent you from doing it. And I don't encourage you to put any kind of secret in files. So where does secret go? So Dynaconf supports some ways of doing it. There are the simple solution and the more complex solution. But the most important thing is that reading those secrets is going to be flexible and dynamic. So the first thing that Dynaconf provides is a very naive solution, but works especially for development environments, which is you pass an additional file to your Dynaconf instance called .secrets.toml. Can be any name, but this is like the community has standardized this kind of file. Can be like YAML, can be a Python file, any file supported by Dynaconf. And then in that separated file, you put your secrets. So let's say it's in your local environment and you have like all your secret keys there, you have everything you want. So this works the same way as the .env file in some projects, but it's like more in the Dynaconf style, and you can separate it from your .env so you know that things are different. And then you ensure that you put this file in your git ignore, so you're never going to commit this. It's for your local environment. I see people using this approach in production environment. That's okay if it's managed well. The secret in the file is okay. If you want to encrypt this file, it's also supported. Dynaconf supports using 2 kinds of encryption. I don't have this as part of this presentation, but it can be also encrypted to give another layer of security, but it's not the best solution. But anyway, this works. This usually is what people start with, and you see that you can read your data from there easily. You don't need to do any change in your application. You just read it directly from app config. And one thing that you are seeing different here is that now you can use config, which is a Flask, usually dict-like object. So you usually read this like in this highlighted part here, like if it was a dictionary. But with Dynaconf, you can use the dot notation and you can use like the same things we do with dictionary access. So this works, but there are better ways to do. One of the better ways to do is using some specialized service for holding your secrets. So by default, Dynaconf supports Vault from HashiCorp. So you spin up your Vault, you enable, and you put the credentials and configuration for Dynaconf to connect to your vaults, and then it's going to be loading the secrets from there. In the documentation, it's explained. Also, it supports using a Redis instance and other kinds of services that works in the same way. There is another way, which usually people prefer, which gives more flexibility, but requires programming a little bit. So it's not like just a simple Flask application. You're going to need to have a separate file to load, but it's very simple. So in this example here, I'm putting a secret key in a file in my temp. So let's imagine this is a job running in a CI, and I'm gonna have there on the CI a tmp secrets.py, and there I have my secrets. So this can be created by Ansible, for example. This can be part of Kubernetes mounting for you. But anyway, the secrets is gonna be in a separate file, and it's just like Python variables. And when you are going to run your Flask environment, you export secrets for Dynaconf and point to one file, or you can point to multiple files that's going to be merged together. And then you simply run your application and you can read the secret key normally from that Python file. I showed here a Python file, but as I said before, it can be Python, Toml, YAML, any format that is supported by Dynaconf. Using a Python file is flexible because now you can do this. So you can use, for example, you want your application to start every time with a random secret key. You can do this, which is not recommended, but I don't know, maybe there's a use case for this. Then you can use just Python. Dynaconf will load it lazily. Dynaconf will manage how it's executed, and then we'll load the value for you here. What I see people doing is also using your secret management provider to load it. So instead of relying on the Dynaconf implementation of Vault or Redis, you can use, for example, the AWS Secret Manager SDK and just read your secrets from there, and then you do anything you want as long as you deliver the Python variable to Dynaconf to read, and then it's going to work in the same way. So it allows you to load secrets in multiple ways. There's no limit, and still your Flask application is transparent, and you ensure that the data is where it should be. Yeah, so another thing that usually we do with Flask applications is loading Flask extensions. So I put two extensions here just as example, but I loaded Flask Simple Login, which will give us a very simple login system with form, with password validation and login and logout features. It's really small and simple. And I loaded here the awesome Flask debug toolbar extension that I think everyone uses to debug things in graphical applications when you have an UI. So it's very nice. And the way we load this is just like passing our app to those two things. And then now when you run, you see that now you have a login page in the /login, and you have this debug toolbar for you to do lots of things that are very useful. So this is very common, and there is one problem with this approach, which is now I'm running with debug equals true, and this is what enables the debug toolbar you see on the sidebar here. And once I put this in production, the bug is going to be false. I think everyone validates it, and the debug toolbar is not going to show. But we are still loading it, so there are still some overhead of loading it. Not too much, but the bits are there, and we don't want it. So usually people will be creating guard clauses here, like doing some ifs to load. But Dynaconf provides a better standardized way, so you don't need to like figure out ifs what it's doing. So how Dynaconf provides the support, instead of putting your extensions in the application file like I did here, and for example, let's say I go to production with debug true in Flask env production, and then I expose my sidebar like I did here. Instead of doing it, I just go and put my extensions in the settings. So now I'm following the 12-factor app. I'm making my extension loading very dynamic, flexible, and I can do things like this. Obviously that you need to understand which extensions are not very like critical. So you're gonna load this way only the extensions that are optional depending on the environment. And then what Dynaconf is going to do is you just need to tell Dynaconf that there is an extensions list to be loaded. And then in your settings file, you export the extension list using this import format. So this follows the same thing we have in Django. So if you ever worked with Django, you know there is an installed apps there where you can put your list of the applications that are installed, and you can do you can load applications dynamically. So in this way, you can do this easily. So you see that by default, I load only the Flask Simple Login. As you are seeing here on the right side, I don't have the debug toolbar, and that's how I go to production. But then when I'm running on the development environment, I created here another section called development. And I say that debug is going to be true. And on the extensions, I'm going to ask Dynaconf to merge whatever is found in this list. And it's going to merge the Flask debug toolbar extension. So if I run this way, you're gonna see that now I'm running in the development, and then I have the debug toolbar. So again, my Flask application is clean, and everything that is here is managed by Dynaconf, is very well tested because Dynaconf has a lot of testing coverage and is standardized so everyone knows where to find the information about the extension loading. So you might be thinking, this is a lot of data sources. I can load my data from the Flask application itself, from the environment variables, from config files, from external services. How do I manage this? How do I know where the value is coming from when I'm doing troubleshooting? So Dynaconf also provides you with CLI application, so you can go to your Flask environment, export Flask app pointing to your Flask application, and run the Dynaconf. For example, Dynaconf list is going to list you all the variables that are defined. In this example here, it's listing only one key that I asked for, and you're gonna see that we have that value here. You can ask for nested levels and access exact the value you want. You can also get this in a very raw way, so you can pipe it in the Unix shell to other applications if you need. And also you can list the extension. So this is going to be important for you for debugging and troubleshooting. But still, this doesn't show you where the data comes from. So Dynaconf provides another tool that is very useful, which is called inspect. And inspect is a command that is going to show you the history of how Dynaconf loaded your settings from the start of your application until it's ready to run. So here it outputs a JSON, so you can use this JSON in the command line. You can pass it to any kind of application you want. You can serialize it and serve in an API or web application, so you can do anything you want. But the important thing is that if you want to know where the extensions come from, so you're going to see the current value. So I have this 2 extension being loaded. You're going to see the history. So it started here. So here I had my first snapshot of the extensions on the default environment. I had only Flask simple login. So you know that this is what we saw in the config file. But the history is like all the stages of Dynaconf merges through the time of the application cycle. So you're going to see that the latest point is where we loaded the same settings file, but in the development section. And now we have a merge equal true, and we are including the bug extension. So then that's why the current state is here. So this information is all you need to understand. Like if you want to know, you have some variable sets and you want to know what's happening with the application. So this is very useful for an environment using Dynaconf. So that's all I have to show you. So if you want to know a little bit about more about Dynaconf, you can go to my Twitter, and I'm always wanting to talk about Dynaconf. We have a Matrix channel, which is called Dynaconf. You can go to Matrix and look there. And also you can go to dynaconf.com. All the links are there. We have Matrix channel. We have a mailing list. We have a repository with discussions. The project is open for contributions. And the idea is to make life of Flask developers easy. So that's it. So with Dynaconf, you can go from the very basic application where you have to think about how to manage those kind of variables. You can go to a solution that can grow depending on the size of your application. You can go to solutions where you're going to use environment variables like we see here, and also you are going to solutions where you're going to use file or you're going to use external services. But as you can see, you are very well supported by the library, and you can do anything. You can start simple and build the blocks for your configuration management. So that's all I have to show. Thank you all for coming, for watching this presentation. I'm available in the chat to answer any question you have. And that's all. Thank you. Bye.